Take me to another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical, magical land. Magical, magical land. To another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical, magical land.
Today's show is another XYZ Playground Edition where I meet with Joshua Nuttall, exploring how leaders of today can learn from leaders of tomorrow. Today's topic is connecting and creating engagement in organizations. Please welcome to the show with Joshua again. Hey Joshua, how are you doing? Welcome back.
Jens, good to see you again, and super glad that we've made this a regular occurrence.
Yes. Weather is getting better here in Germany. So the forecast is plus 14, which is like the lowest winter temperature for you, I guess.
Yeah, soon you're going to be sending me sunrise photos, and we're going into here in the southern hemisphere.
Yeah. What is the lowest temperature you have in winter normally in South Africa?
Well, I think it depends where you are in the country, but it can get right down into the minuses if you go up into the mountain regions, but nothing like Germany. But where I'm based on the coast at the moment, probably the lowest is maybe your low teens, around 10 degrees Celsius or something like that. So nothing compared to Germany, but it's cold and it becomes wet in certain parts of South Africa in winter. So yeah.
One day I will come and visit you and check the winter out. Good. So today we're looking into connecting and creating engagement in a pandemic world, and of course we're merging that with the young thinkers view as every time. But before we go into the connection and in creating engagement, what has changed for you over your career from a workspace perspective?
Yeah, Jens, I think that's a great question sort of to start off this conversation today when you think about connecting and creating, and then you refer to engagement very well. And I think maybe if I wind the clock back a couple of years, and I've only been on this journey of mine since I started working back in 2014, so it's 7 years now. And I think there are some changes that we've seen, definitely in the last 12 years, but maybe even before that. So if I think back to the way that I started out my career, and I was fortunate enough to start out in what I would term now as a startup, in a startup ecosystem. So you were doing a lot of everything. You didn't necessarily have one specific role. And I think that's suited to who I am as a person and has helped my professional and personal development inside of those 7 years. But maybe to get more specific around some of the things that I noticed when I started. And the first was around your onboarding. So how were you onboarded into that company? And I think I didn't start inside a massive corporate, but I worked in work experience scenarios and opportunities leading up to starting my formal career as a professional. And I think the one thing that I noticed between those two examples was the formality around onboarding. So even inside a corporate, you had to get a specific laptop, you had to get certain passwords sorted out, you had to complete certain documents inside of that space. And there was almost like a massive rigmarole to bring you on board into the company. Something that maybe, and where the two scenarios differed, was around the culture and how that culture was ingrained in the onboarding side of things. So that's different between a startup and a formal organization in terms of what I experienced. And then lastly, where I think a lot of things have shifted is the way that people are now digitally onboarded in terms of that and how they are communicated with. And I think in the past where it was way more physical, i.e. you were in an office or had to go to a physical space to get onboarded and welcomed into the company, we've now been challenged, especially over the last 12 months, to think about how we can build our digital engagement channels and engagements going forward for when we onboard people into the organization. But yeah, as we've mentioned before, you've got more experience than I have. So what are some of the stories that you have from when you started your career back in the big corporate world?
Yeah, I started my career not in the corporate world. So when I was starting on construction sites, working as an electrician 24 years ago, or 25 almost, of course, that was completely different. So the onboarding process is different. It's basically you shadow someone going into the construction work and learning that. But when I then moved more towards an office perspective, what was quite interesting, it's like even from the office setup, it was different at that time. So it's like maybe some listeners still know that it was like single person offices, maybe two people in an office, and because I have been working from a construction perspective for office buildings, and we supported them in changing stuff. So I have seen the transformation from going from a single or corner office where the big boss was sitting to like, hey, we're in an open space environment over the last 20 years, and then having different adoption of that going forward. So that's already an interesting perspective where you see things are changing from a physical environment, which then has as well an interesting effect on the environment where you work and the culture environment, which was quite interesting. And then what I learned is as well, it's different from culture to culture, because I've been living in 4 countries. So it was always different. The onboarding process is different. The way of people engage with you. And of course, that's depending on the local culture of the country, but it's also dependent on the culture of the company, which was it's quite interesting that has changed quite dramatically for me over time. And then I was fortunate enough to as well build onboarding plans, like you mentioned, for people in different ways. And I've learned a lot in how you do that as well, how you build teams from a scratch perspective, how do you engage people when they start in a new role, and how to bring them as fast as possible on speed that they can be productive in an environment. So it's quite interesting, and it was not always successful. But I think the most successful version and a bit of story was when I was building up an innovation team when I was living in Russia. We built a team which has basically no background in innovation. So I recruited people not with an innovation background. I recruited people who were having different backgrounds and more coming from a business angle, but from different parts of the business into the team. And what we did is we spent quite a fair amount of time in getting to know each other in the beginning, which was from a culture perspective and as well inside the business completely different than what they at least have experienced. So we went into the famous castle in Poland, which was we took part in the College of Extraordinary Experience, which I highly recommend for everyone who is looking into team buildings. You should be doing, though that it was not the goal of team building. It was a different goal, but it was, I think, one of the best starting points for a team I've ever been part of and was luckily to lead at that time. So it was really transforming the team from individuals in a couple of weeks, being in this environment, spending a lot of time with each other and learning from each other fairly quickly into a tight team, which of course then changed a lot of the dynamics of interactions and so on.
Yeah, and I maybe just want to double click on a few things that you mentioned. So the first was the transition between what we'll call cubicle style offices into more open plan, open space offices, and what that does from a connection standpoint is quite fascinating. And there have been various studies that have been done around what that does to organizational efficiency, idea generation, creativity, and the way of work for different people. Yeah. And I think that you raised a super point there, Jens, around how the physical space that you're in actually impacts the work that you're able to do. And I think that in this digital world that we are all now living in, and like I mentioned, we've been forced into it. There are different considerations that you need to take, and you also need to consider when you're building out a team, how are you doing that and how are you fostering those connections, and are you creating enough spaces for people to interact with one another? Yeah.
And that's maybe one good example is as well how we met each other last year, which is full digital. So that's something I've never experienced for myself as well. So I was, of course, working in a global environment. So I was connecting to a lot of people around the world, being used to video already. But starting something was always in a physical environment. Starting, or at least in the first 2 months, you have met each other in a personal way. And when we started the journey with the XYZ Playground, where it was and is still digital, and we have never met in person, and I don't know when we will be able to do that as well from a time perspective. So I think that's also an interesting experiment for myself to see is how do you curate that in a way that it is working. And I think, yes, of course, we have done a lot of mistakes, but at least the two of us have managed to stay connected and get to know each other far deeper than we would do in different other ways. So that's quite interesting to experience as well, in opening up conversations.
Yeah, and it's fascinating points that you raise again, Jens, just around that deeper connection. And I think that's something that we all need to think about in this digital first age that we are now living in. And how do we foster those deeper connections? Because I think and we've referred to it in different scenarios and different conversations about recreating the water cooler moments inside of the digital space. And if you think about the digital tools that we all use on a daily basis now and have become very well acquainted to, how do you create those water cooler moments inside of those digital rooms or tools that we are using? And I think there's still some way to go from a technology standpoint. If we were both part of a conversation last week where we discussed Zoom fatigue and why different models like Clubhouse are now taking shape, because people are enjoying not having to have their cameras on because of the emotional pressure that it puts on them inside having a camera on a call and things like that. And the way that we consume different things. And one of the biggest things when I start thinking about, connecting and creating an engagement is around where you're meeting people. And I think that we've experienced different ways that people work in this digital age, but we've also experienced different ways that people approach certain things when they are forced to use digital tools inside of their current space. And it's quite interesting, in preparing for this talk and this conversation today, one of the things that I started thinking about was how and what have we learned from different experiences that we've had in the last little while. And what I specifically mean to is, would people who have worked in this way that they are being forced to work now, had they had the choice?
Okay.
And I don't think that they would have, because it's quite interesting. We're talking about connecting and creating an engagement space today, but do we create that engagement space by ourselves, or do we need to get forced into an engagement? And I think that's quite an interesting topic, maybe just to chat on for a few minutes.
Yeah, super interesting point. Because I was part, maybe just to give a little bit background, I have built up everything I do with all my businesses is digital first. So and in a remote first setting, because I want to have the freedom for myself and my family to say, hey, we're spending 5 months over there, and I can still keep everything in the same way, like work-wise. So I can work from everywhere in the whole world. I just need a laptop and a camera. That's it. Maybe now a microphone. So I've built that up in that way over the last 2 years. So for me, it's natural. But I was exposed, was it last week or the week before, to the local community where I live in Germany right now, where they organize like online meetings and so on. And it's like the local chamber of commerce. What was quite interesting they said they lost a couple of participants on the way because they don't want to meet on Zoom. They don't want to communicate in a digital way. And then I was realizing, hey, I'm living on a different planet compared to some of the colleagues on the call from an experience perspective, but as well on how I set up the business, because their whole business model, everything they do is physical first. So they have never done video meetings before in their whole life, maybe on a personal level, but everything is physical. So every client relation is physical. Everything they do, interaction with their customers, is physical, and that was taken away from them. So what is fairly easy for me, because that's how I've set it up from the beginning, is completely hard for them. And I wasn't realizing that hard and that how difficult it is. And I think that's not an age perspective. It's more of how you started your business and how it works. So, for example, if you work in a construction industry, you're not doing Facebook live streams with your customers. If we just take a stupid example, you're meeting on construction sites, or you're meeting in a planning environment where you look into how do we construct, how do we build the next building, and how do you plan that properly. So that's the environment where you're in, but it's most of the time it's physical, because I've been working in that field. I mean, it's always physical, but it's not working in that way today. So it's quite interesting how threatened they are from just a way of thinking as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a perfect segue into the next point around, talking about future workspaces. And I love what you said around how physical environments enable engagement. But now, if we think about it from a digital perspective, and to use your word of remote first, how are we using remote first to create and enable engagement inside of that space? And I think if we now talk about future of workspaces, and there's a lot of context and content out there where people and big organizations are asking big questions about what does the future look like, because they're worried about retaining the top talent, they're worried about attracting the top talent, and they're also worried, or not worried, but wanting to create an environment where their employees can produce the best work possible. And so I don't know, you've worked inside some big corporates and organizations. What are some of the considerations that you think they should be paying closer attention to inside of that space?
Yeah, number one, enabling everyone in the whole organization to do that technically. And that sounds maybe fun, and we're joking about that, but I am still connected to a lot of colleagues around the world who are not enabled to do that. They don't have a laptop from the company. They have a personal laptop, but they don't have a laptop from the company or any digital device even. Not a company phone, nothing. So how should they even do it in a safe environment from a corporate perspective? So that's already a starting point, where that's number one. If you're taking care of that, then it's like enable the organization to use tools that are natively used the whole time in a personal setting. And I know there are a lot of security and risk perspectives, but then choose tools that are easy to use for everyone in the whole business. And I think that's where I would like to throw the question as well towards you. How do you do that in a way that you connect specifically with the digital natives, with the people who are at least grown up with the digital world, and for them, like for yourself and others, how do you engage with the young thinkers in your business? Because that's also not happening on top of the constraints you already have.
Yeah, and I love that framing that you just used. Obviously, there are constraints from a what's the right word, an infrastructure or systems perspective. But the second constraint may be around how are you enabling and creating an engagement environment for all levels inside the organization, so that people do feel empowered and so that they can produce their best work. And I think in starting to think about that question, Jens, I sort of go back to the needs, dreams, and desires of younger thinkers and younger people inside of that space. And you might, those listening and those watching might be thinking, why are you starting with needs, dreams, and desires when you're talking about people and you're talking about organizational culture and enablement and things like that? And let me maybe try to explain it quickly. Is when we think about creating and fostering an engagement or connection with people externally, so a business to consumer relationship, those are some of the key questions that people ask that are either building a product, advertisers, or communication experts inside of that space. So if you flip that on its head and you say internally, what are the needs of the people that you're trying to attract or that you're trying to retain inside of your company? What are their dreams? So how are you helping them get to those dreams? And what are their desires? Are you identifying with where they think their future should be from an overall perspective? Are you giving them opportunities to engage with their desires? And are you creating those spaces where they feel empowered inside of the organization to drive the organization over a 10-year period to achieve that? And I think that those are 3 points that I think I would encourage big organizations, but also entrepreneurial startups and small teams to really think about in terms of their startup journey that they are going on. Because just as we think about the importance of connecting and treating customers fairly and building things for the customers, think about your young thinkers inside of your organization and everyone for that matter as customers. And that might just switch on a different mindset, a different part of your brain to allow you to be more empathetic and more understanding in terms of the spaces that you're creating and enabling inside of that engagement culture.
Yeah. And it's easier said than done. If we just take a couple of examples I have seen. So it started with PowerPoint presentation where let's say a global or a top management is doing a presentation, then they went to live streaming, which is still sending. So they're sending and they're presenting towards the whole world or the whole company, which is one-way communication still. But it's not. I haven't seen it too often that the engagement is enabled from a company perspective, that you are creating an engagement opportunity for people to speak up. And of course, they always ask inside these big meetings, hey, anyone having a question? Then 2-3 people are asking questions, but it's not engagement. That's just it's like a controlled environment, but it's more, how do you create a non-controlled environment where people can openly contact the CEO or whatever. And then I've seen, you have this email where you can send something to the CEO. I'm even not sure if the CEO is reading it, depending on how big the company is. But it's really, how do you do this in a way that it's really fostering engagement, where you have an interaction, and both ways, both parts are learning and engaging with each other. And I think that's also an interesting perspective of what different technologies can be used and how that can be supported from an organization. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think, maybe just exploring the concept of what technologies can be used. And I think going right the way back to, it's far easier to connect and to engage in a physical environment because you're not constrained by the technologies that you have to use. And I think that some of those key technology choices need to be considered by organizations that are building out these frameworks for future workspaces and even current workspaces, because that forms a big part of your culture. And I think maybe to take a step further inside of that is, we've spoken a lot about onboarding and creating engagement and fostering relationships and things like that. But something that we've chatted about before on this podcast, but also in different circles, is around ecosystem thinking. And I think, in preparation for this, I found an article that spoke about the offboarding process. And that, for me, as a young thinker, talks about this concept of a community and how you're actually way bigger, or rather part of a much bigger system than just the specific company that you're working for, and the importance of identifying and creating an offboarding journey correctly, so that when an employee leaves, and not every employee will leave your organization in good faith or with the best intentions at heart, but you give that person the opportunity to bring you future business going forward. Because if they've had a great experience, and if you've enabled and created an empowerment culture, and they feel like they've achieved something in the organization that they're working with and then leave, I certainly have experienced that in my personal side of things, where I've remained connected with the businesses that I've left. And you drive referral business, and there's a saying out there in the world that referrals are the best form of marketing because they don't cost you anything. And I think that while that might sound cliche, I think that offboarding and creating a process inside of that really does allow you to be part of a bigger community.
Yeah, and that's even more important going forward. Let's say if you look into the last 50 years, there are people who are spending a long time in a large organization or in organizations. I just gave you the example of my brother, who has now 25 years in his first business and is still working there. That's rarely happening going forward, and that's still already rare today. I mean, I have worked in a couple of companies, and inside these companies, I've had different jobs as well. And I think that will be for the younger generation, let's say, who are now early 20s, they most probably will work in 10 or 15 or 20 companies in their whole life, and not just for one big corporation. Maybe there are some who are still doing that, but it's not that you spend 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in one business. So this, like you said, this offboarding and onboarding procedure is super important to build a relationship and foster the relationship going forward, but also building a learning engine inside the business of what is the reason this person is leaving. And I've seen that over and over again with larger companies. They do this sometimes in a questionnaire where they just send you, hey, why did you leave? What's going on? And then depending in which mood the person is, they're answering it truly, or they're answering what they think the other side want to hear, just to keep a little bit of, hey, I'm a good employee and I don't want to leave in a bad way. But that's then hindering the learning opportunity for the organization. And then when you change that every 3, 4, 5 years, being in a different organization, being in a different job, then it's even more important to stay connected to the others around you, to the ecosystem, like you said. super important.
Yeah, and I think, Jens, maybe just to expand on two things that you said there. One was around the length of employment, and the article for those that would be interested in reading it is it's titled "Turning Departing Employees into Loyal Alumni." Yeah. And I think that the one side of things is, like I mentioned, the length of employment. So inside of the article, they talk about how the average job tenure in the United States has shrunk to about 4.1 years. And again, they reference the data sets that they use to get that. And the second is around creating a connection. And I think that just as after reading this, and sort of some of my thinking was around, why do we build out alumni networks? And why do we build out loyalty programs for brands and loyal customers and things like that? And if you bring that thinking into an organization and you say, okay, well, what are you trying to create? You're trying to create an environment where people feel empowered, they feel connected, and you've created a space in doing so to foster the engagement inside of that. And I think that's all important, especially from a young thinker's perspective, to think about how you're doing that when they first come into the door. And I mean, we're doing a lot of work on culture at the moment, so maybe that's why that's the conversation is leaning towards that. But if you think bigger, and now you think about global change, and some of the change that we hope to drive with the XYZ Playground and the reverse mentor business and model that we're building out, is around how can we enable that space for young thinkers to have a seat at the table, growing out their skills and things and developing them into the leaders of tomorrow inside of that space. So, one of the things that you and I are both passionate about inside the XYZ Playground is how can the leaders of today learn from the leaders of tomorrow? And we've often referred to how reverse mentorship is bi-directional in terms of enabling young thinkers to learn as much as they are giving to the leaders of today. They're also learning so that they can become better leaders of tomorrow. And we've had other conversations about how even the reverse mentors of today can learn from much younger thinkers, people who are 16, 17. And that's a different discussion, which I'm sure we'll get to in later conversations.
I agree. No, I think just from the outset of, if you have in mind that you want to create an engagement engine as a business in itself, so where you have the possibility of orchestrating that, if you just have that already as a target or something you're seeking for, that's already the biggest step you can do, because then you look for opportunities on how to do that. And there will be, I don't know, gazillion ways of how that works in each different business, in each different local culture. But it's just having that in mind and seeing that as an opportunity to get people on board, learn from each other, and really share. Because that's what I've seen in large organizations. They have idea sharing tools and all this kind of old school methodologies, which are fine in itself, but it doesn't work if you don't have a trustful business, if you don't have a trustful organization, where you can just say, no, I don't agree with our CEO because of this, as a young mind inside the business. That's not necessarily saying that the CEO needs to change direction because 5 people are saying something. That's his or her responsibility. But I think it's having a way of understanding each other will already help a lot. Because if we go back to the human needs and parts you mentioned, it's everyone wants to belong. And if you create something where people are willing to belong, then they will not leave, or they will at least stay as long as they feel well inside of that ecosystem, and that will help the company to be better, to be more profitable, and so on. I think that's something every business should be focusing on. Though what I see, a lot of businesses are just focusing on short term, where it's more important to earn the dollar today rather than tomorrow and next year, and not focusing towards a bigger perspective. I still see it every day.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a great bridge in terms of, we've spoken a lot today about engagement and how we're creating the spaces and future workspaces and changing workspaces over time. And maybe, thinking it reminds me of a podcast that I listened to where Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Facebook, he mentioned the world and the work that they're doing with Oculus and the virtual reality space. And he said, that also excites me in terms of, he spoke specifically about where he sees VR from a connection standpoint. And Jens, you referred to it earlier, is around, we've never met in person. But Mark was talking about how he sees meetings of the future popping on a virtual headset, and me hopping onto your couch in Germany, or you hopping onto the beach here in South Africa.
Yeah,
and that's
I would rather prefer that.
That's the world that he sort of thinks about. And then you say, we are, he says that's 10 years away. Who knows how long that's away, because there are technological constraints inside of that. But you think about, it excites me because of the deeper connections and relationships that you can build using technology. And I think, to reiterate what you said, is we really need to think about the people that we're trying to serve inside of us and how we are trying to connect with them, rather than just throwing technologies at problems and saying that technology will sort it out. Let's actually challenge ourselves to think deeper and to identify with those needs, dreams, and desires of the people inside of the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point and statement and closing to today's conversation. We'll be going into more details and more topics in the next version. Thank you again for joining me, Joshua. It was a pleasure having you. If you're interested in more of these topics, if you're interested in arguing with us, jumping on a call together where we discuss a specific topic where you're interested, just let us know. Give us comments in wherever you find us talking, in an audio version or video version, or in any of the social networks. So that's it for today. Thank you, Joshua, and see you next week again.
Cheers, Jens.
Cheers.
Take me to another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical, magical land, magical, magical land. To another place where the